Well, today on Pentecost Sunday, actually, do you guys know it's Pentecost? Today we are launching a new series that we're going to be in for the next 6 weeks beginning today. It's called So What Is God Like? If we can get our title slide. So what is God like? Or maybe even more specifically, what's God really like? Because the reality is there's some misperceptions about God, even amongst Christians, even that we ourselves hold. And the question is, what's God really like? Meaning, let me just unpack that question a little bit. If there is, in fact, a creator, a being outside of the natural world who's responsible for life, what is that being like? Is God, or the gods, as some people believe, is God good or bad or something in between? Is God merciful or vindictive? Is God consistent or capricious and unpredictable? Is God kind or mean-spirited? What is God really like? That question and the proposed answers to that question have been a theme really throughout human history. In every time, in every place. And various people have asked that question and answered it in various ways. But I want to say this morning. This is not just a question at the heart of religion. This is a question at the heart of much of the arts, entertainment, education, government. Like what we believe about God, whether we're conscious about that belief or not, it shapes everything. I think actually this question, what is God like? This is probably the most important question, or one of the most important questions any of us will ever ask and answer. What we believe about God matters. What God is really like matters if God remains involved in the universe or whether he has abandoned us to our own devices. What God is really like matters as to whether we have accountability about how we live and how we behave. In other words, do we answer to a higher being for how we live, both individually and how we live corporately, nationally? Do we answer? What God is really like matters if there is some sort of purpose to our existence, if there's a plan that can be discovered and followed, or if there's a plan that can be rejected. What God is really like matters if we find ourselves at odds with him, when we've offended or disobeyed him. Then what? What's God like? That matters, right? Those are big picture questions. Those are questions that people have wrestled with and again, answered in various ways. We can get more specific. We can get specific about people that are, in fact, believers in God, followers of Jesus, and that question still matters greatly. What we believe about God matters when we are confronted with desires and habits that are outside of God's instructions and ways. God's told us how we should live. And when our culture lives in ways that are different than that, that's one thing. And then there's also what happens in us. I mean, just take, for example, the issue of marriage and our sexual expression. And the way that our culture thinks about and practices those things is very different than what we find as God's design and God's plan. So that matters for our culture, but what about us? What about when our behaviors are other or different? What if our desires are different than God's ways? When the way that God instructs us to treat one another is not, in fact, the way that we treat one another, then what we believe about God matters. What we believe about God matters when we face uncertain and chaotic times, when we get a terrifying diagnosis, when we find ourselves in trouble, in various forms of trouble, when we are enslaved to patterns and behaviors that we can't seem to break out of, when we find ourselves crushed on every side by circumstances of our own making and also circumstances that we have zero control over. What we believe about God matters. It matters when we're afraid for our children and our loved ones. It matters when we've suffered injustice and our oppressor seems to have gotten away with it. It matters when we feel overwhelmed by depression, debt, uncertainty, fear, guilt, shame. Then what we believe about God matters. And if it matters that much, the question is, well, how can we know? Because the proposed answers to that question throughout human history have not been the same. So again, the question, how do we know what God is really like? How can we know what an invisible being is like who is outside of our natural order? A God that we can't touch or see or quantify. How can we know what he's really like? Well, in reality, the only way we could know what that being was really like is if he told us, if he self-disclosed, if he self-revealed, this is what I'm like. Today we begin a 6-week series in which God has said, this is what I'm like, bank on it, act on it, throw yourself on my character, build your life on my character, not yours, which is really important, as we're gonna see. So today we start this 6-week series, and we're gonna do a brief overview this morning of this place where God reveals himself. And then we're gonna spend 5 weeks doing a deep dive, kind of drilling down on each of the characteristics that God uses to describe himself. It's as if God has said through this self-revelation and self-disclosure, he's said, this is what I, your creator, your invisible God, this is what I'm like. And how you should then live with that knowledge, regardless of how you feel or what situation you find yourselves in. And this is why this is so important. This is why we as a church, we're gonna grab onto this and spend 5 weeks on it, because our feelings about God and about our relationship with God, they're all over the map, right? I'm a pretty steady guy, like this is my highs and this is my lows. And I have emotional roller coasters as it relates to how I feel about God at times. God's unchanging, my feelings are not, and my experience is not. So the question is, what is God really like, and how do I build my life on that? We're gonna be in Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7 for the next 6 weeks, at least in part. That's where we find God's self-disclosure. It's actually his self-disclosure to Moses and to the first generation of Israel that came out of Egypt. And as we spend the next 6 weeks in that, I want you to understand these verses are possibly the most important in the Hebrew scripture, what we call the Old Testament often. These are maybe the most important. They're the most quoted and the most referenced by other people throughout the Hebrew scriptures. By poets, by priests, by kings, by prophets. People quote this verse or reference this verse back to God and say, remember, you said this. And they were learning how to build their lives on God's revealed character, regardless of what was going on in their life, actually because of what was going on in their lives, right? That's the invitation. These two verses, Exodus 34, 6 and 7, they've been described as the John 3:16 of the Old Testament because they're that important, they were that well known. So that's where we're gonna be. To appreciate and understand what we find there, we have to back up and do a little bit of biblical survey. So we'll talk about this morning, we're gonna talk about what led up to Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. We're gonna pick up in Genesis 12. Genesis 12 says, in that chapter, we find that God calls a man named Abram. Abram means exalted father. His name later is changed to Abraham, which means father of nations or father of a multitude. But here he's known as Abram. God calls a man named Abram to follow him to an unknown land and promises to make from him a great nation through whom he will bless all the families of the earth. This is really important. God's calling him he says, through you, I'm going to create a special people who have a special relationship with me, but their special relationship is through them, I'm going to bless all the nations of the earth. Abram doesn't know God yet. In fact, Joshua 24 tells us that when God spoke to him, Abram was living with his ancestors in Ur of the Chaldeans, worshiping idols. Chaldeans, that's the place that eventually becomes Babylon. And we know that that's not really known as a place with a high knowledge of God. That's Abram. But God comes to him with an invitation, and for some reason, he has the faith to follow what is truly an unknown God to him. He steps out in faith, not knowing where he's going, not really knowing who he's following. He's 75 years old. In Genesis 12, he's 75 years old. He and his wife, Sarai, have never had children. They've tried, but they're barren, infertile. And so when God says, I'm going to make of you a great nation, that's like, well, that touches on something that's dear to his heart, but that's a promise that's yet unanswered. He undoubtedly expects that his wife will conceive soon, but 10 years pass and they're still childless, which brings us to Genesis 15, where Abram actually asks God about that thing. He said, I've been following you for 10 years and we're still childless. We're not getting any younger. He's 85, she's now 75. And he's like, Genesis 15, God restates the promise. In response to that, God restates the promise, and he warns that Abram's descendants will first spend 400 years afflicted and enslaved to a foreign nation. God says, I've got this. I am going to give you a child. I'm going to give you an heir, and I'm going to multiply the generations. He gives this warning that the future generations will spend 400 years enslaved to a foreign nation. But then he says this, he says, at the end of that 400 years, he's going to bring judgment on the nation that has oppressed them. And he says, I'm going to lead you out of slavery, lead your descendants out of slavery with great possessions. Okay? Just put a pin in that. He says, you will leave slavery with great possessions. So the remainder of Genesis tells the story of the first three generations, beginning with the birth of Isaac. Isaac is eventually born to Abraham and Sarah. When he is eventually born, they are 100 years old. Well, no, Abram's 100 years old. Sarai is 90. She's actually in menopause. But understand this. So what God's doing is a miracle. It's something that can't be accomplished by human means and human strength. He's doing something miraculous. That's why he waited as long as he did. But there's something just like, this is a worthy point of us noticing. Sometimes the promises of God don't happen on our timeline. And if there's promises of God that you're praying into, that you're waiting for, Abraham waited for 25 years. And God was faithful. So this is not about God's character. I mean, it is about God's character. But that timeline, we have to hold on to that with an open hand. So God will lead them out of slavery. We jump forward to Exodus 1. So the rest of Genesis is the story of those three generations. In Exodus 1, we find that Abraham's descendants have multiplied and in fact become strong now in the land of Egypt, but they have been enslaved and afflicted and have become the target of infant genocide. Exodus 1 tells us the story of how the current Pharaoh has ordered every baby to be slaughtered at birth, every baby boy to be slaughtered at birth. And if that sounds familiar to you, besides the Exodus story, it's because it's kind of a hot link to something that happens later in the New Testament. In Matthew, we find that it's Herod who has ordered the destruction of all the baby boys 2 and under in Israel. And there's a boy that escapes that slaughter to become a deliverer, right? So the current Pharaoh has ordered that. In Exodus 2 through 14, so this is several chapters, God raises up Moses, through whom he delivers the people, which is Israel, out of Egyptian slavery by means of 10 supernatural plagues and a miraculous journey through the Red Sea. And so for the people of Israel, we could liken this to their salvation and baptism, right? They were rescued out of slavery in Egypt. They were brought through the water of the Red Sea to new life on the other side, to the journey to a promised land. Like this is salvation and baptism. Exodus 15 through 18, on the other side of that, God leads the people from the Red Sea to the foot of Mount Sinai in the wilderness. This takes about 2 months. So again, they come through the Red Sea. They spend about 2 months journeying to the Sinai wilderness, and specifically the foot of Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai is where Moses had first been called by God, had the whole burning bush experience. So he's been there already, and God's spoken to him. Now he's there again with the people. And during that 2 months, the people are following a God that they really don't know. I mean, we have the advantage of, 66 books of scripture that give us insight into God's nature and character, and there's a lot of things that we can take for granted. These people had spent 400 years in slavery in Egypt where they were surrounded by the gods of the Egyptians. Their formation has not taught them to know God. And so they're following a God they know very little about, but they already begin to experience his powerful and loving care for them in spite of their grumbling. Just in that little window, the 2-month window between Red Sea and Mount Sinai, God provides for them water in the wilderness miraculously 3 times. He turns sweet or bitter water sweet in one place. He gives them, he leads them to a place, an oasis of 12 springs of water in the middle of the desert. And then he even brings water out of a rock during their journey. This is a loving, powerful God. He daily provides miraculous bread every morning that just shows up when they wake up. He gives them supernatural victory over the Amalekites when they're attacked by a foreign nation. All that brings them to the foot of Mount Sinai in chapter 19. And here we go to chapter 19, which is a significant kind of step in this journey. Beginning in Exodus 19, God now invites the people into a covenant relationship with him to be his own special people through whom he will bless all the nations of the earth. Remember the promise to Abraham in Genesis 12? Through your descendants, I'm going to multiply them, and through them I'll establish a blessing to all the nations. That's what God's now doing with his people. So up until now, though, here's the pivot, here's the shift that happens. Up until now, God has initiated everything. Even the language of covenants tells us that the type of covenant that they've entered into is one that has all been on God's initiation. He appeared to Abram when Abram wasn't looking for him. He came and found the people in Egypt and rescued them out of Egypt, right? So he's been initiating everything, and now he's inviting them to reciprocate as his covenant people. We could liken this to a marriage. It's like God is proposing to the people. It's like he's saying, I've shown you that I'm committed to you. Will you now commit to me? That's the invitation. So to begin this, God summons Moses up Mount Sinai where he instructs him what he's going to say to the people. When Moses comes down, let's listen to the proposal that God gives Moses to share with the people in 19:3. The Lord called to him, meaning Moses, out of the mountain saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the people of Israel, you yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. That kingdom of priests and holy nation, that's reframing and maybe expanding what it means for them to be a blessing to all the nations of the earth, right? It's going to be their job to mediate his nature, his presence, his image, his relationship, his ways, his will to all the peoples of the earth. And so that's his proposal, will you enter into a covenant to keep my ways and be my people? Here's what happens in 19:7. So Moses came and he called the elders of the people and set before them all the words that the Lord had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. They agree to his covenant. God has proposed. The people have accepted. This is their we do, right? Now their side of the covenant relationship has begun. But just to further develop this wedding metaphor, they've made vows. Vows have been exchanged between God and the people. He's the groom, they're the bride. Vows have been exchanged, but the ceremony isn't over yet. Think about the weddings that I pastor. Oftentimes when I'm pastoring, officiating a wedding, there will be, pretty early on in the ceremony, there's an exchange of vows, and that's when both parties say to each other, I do. In this case, they're saying, we do, right? But the ceremony is usually not over. Usually there's something else that happens. A lot of times if it's a Christian wedding, the couple will receive communion together as like the first thing they want to do as in terms of we're gonna build our marriage on God's provision of the gospel and grace and forgiveness, right? And then there's an exchange of rings where they again restate vows to each other. Okay, they've already made vows, but then they say things like, I give you this ring as a token of my love. All that I am, all that I have is yours. With this ring I thee wed. Right? Pastor feeds them the lines. They repeat it. In this case, meaning Moses and the people at the foot of Mount Sinai, the ceremony isn't over, but Moses goes back up the mountain for instructions about the terms of the covenant, about the terms for the marriage that they've just entered into. Basically, the groom is going to make a speech to the people through Moses. So what happens next? In Exodus 20 through 23, this is 4 chapters. Back on Mount Sinai, God reveals his nature by giving Moses the foundation of their relationship. 10 commandments, which are then further fleshed out with some specific application examples. So that's where we find the giving of the 10 commandments. We're going to look at those a little bit. But the reality is then God continues. He doesn't just give them the 10. He begins to expand on them and say, okay, here's what those look like fleshed out in your particular relationships. And he gives them, in this case, in this few chapters, 42 more laws that of an eventual 613. The people will spend 1 year at the foot of Mount Sinai before they leave. And during that time, God will continue to give them more laws. We have all Leviticus and all of that, Deuteronomy. So eventually there'll be 613 laws by most counts. But right here during the ceremony, he gives them the 10 commandments and then 42 more laws. They're laws about to shape the way they live and how they should treat one another. So Moses goes back down the mountain to deliver those instructions to the people. By the way, in all, Moses goes up and down. During this time at Mount Sinai, he goes up and down the mountain 7 times, which I've got to think, he's an older guy at this point. Like, I hope he's got good hiking boots, right? Man. Exodus 24:3, Moses came and told the people all the words of the Lord, 10 commandments, 42 laws, and all the rules. And all the people answered with one voice and said, all the words that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Moses repeats the groom's speech to the people about how their covenant relationship with God is supposed to shape the way that they live and the way they relate to one another. The people double down. They're like, we do. We get it. We heard you. We're in. We can do all of that. We're in. That's their confirmation of the covenant. It's restating their vows. But the ceremony still isn't over because God calls Moses back up the mountain again with the people still gathered at the foot of the mountain. It brings us to Exodus 24 through 31, 8 chapters. What happens here? Over the next 40 days, God gives Moses instructions for how the people are then to worship him, which means, he's given them laws for how they should live. Now what he gives them this time up the mountain is he gives them, here's how we're going to live together. Here's the plans for our house, right? He gives them a blueprint for the tabernacle and all the furnishings. He gives them detailed plans for how to build the Ark of the Covenant, which is the embodiment, the representation of his presence among them. He gives them all the specifics for the priesthood, even the clothes they're supposed to wear and how they're supposed to be consecrated. And all of that takes several chapters and a significant amount of time. It takes 40 days. Meanwhile, Moses is up on the mountain. There's dark cloud. People are down below. They begin to wonder, what happened to Moses, right? Maybe he's dead. After all they can see up there is a dark cloud, thunderbolts and lightning, very, very frightening. And they think, maybe he's dead. And so mid-ceremony, this is a long ceremony, but it's still mid-ceremony, they pivot to a new plan. Which brings us to Exodus 32. Exodus 32, while Moses is still on the mountain, the people fashioned a golden calf using the great possessions they brought with them out of Egypt. And here's what they say to one another. These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. In Genesis 15, God had said, at the end of 400 years, I will bring your descendants out of the land that they have served in, and I will judge the nation they have served, and I will bring them out with great possessions. And those great possessions are supposed to be the building materials for everything that he's giving Moses the plans for on the mountain, for building the tabernacle, for building the Ark of the Covenant. And they take all the materials that God gave to them and they use them to build a new god. They proceed to have a wild party. It's a wedding reception, only with a different groom. And the connotations of the wording that describes their party and the way that that party is understood throughout the rest of Scripture is pretty dark in terms of what sort of behaviors characterize that party. This was a wild, raucous, naughty party. Understand this, they've just broken the first two of the 10 commandments. The 10 commandments were the foundation for the 42 laws and for the 613 laws. The foundation of the 10 commandments was the first two. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that's in the heaven above or on the earth beneath, and you shall not bow down or serve them. They're in the middle of the ceremony and they just broke the first two. So God sends Moses back down the mountain to confront and deal with the people's sin. At least 3,000 people die in the aftermath of this. And this occasion becomes a series of tests for Moses. We're not going to go into all of them. All of this, chapter 32 and 33 are fascinating. I encourage you to read those. But there's a series of tests for Moses where God puts some things out there for Moses to respond to see to help shape Moses' heart as a leader of the people. The question is Moses really committed to lead this people in God's plans for them? And if Moses is really committed to lead this people, how can he do that if they're already rejecting God's ways? If they're already sinning against God, what's this going to be like? Exodus 33 begins with one of the second tests. It says this, the Lord said to Moses, depart, go up from here, you and the people. This whole journey is supposed to be moving towards the promised land. So the implication is now go ahead and leave for the promised land. Depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt. Chapter 32 and 33 are there's some humor in it, for me at least, because God keeps calling the people that you brought out of Egypt. And Moses keeps going, no, you brought them out. They're your people. And he's like, no, they're your people. Depart, go up from here, you and the people that you have brought out of the land of Egypt to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your offspring I will give it. And notice what he says. I'll send an angel before you, and I'll drive out the Canaanites. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey. That's the description of the promised land. Go up to the land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go among you, lest I consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. Moses at this point has already interceded for God to not destroy the people. The way he did this was not by pleading the people's innocence. He did it by urging God to remember the promise that he made to Abraham in Genesis 12. He said, you said you were going to do this. How can you do something that will make people question your faithfulness to your promise? God concedes. He essentially offers a plan B right here, which is another test. So plan B is that I will take you to the promised land. I won't destroy the people, but I can't go up among you. I'll still take you to the promised land, but I won't personally go with you anymore. How could I? Because their foreseeable and expected sin based on this one test case will eventually result in their judgment and their destruction. So God says, I'll just delegate an angel to lead you. Verse 33:4. When the people heard this disastrous word, they mourned. And no one put on his ornaments, that's their party clothes. For the Lord had said to Moses, say to the people, you are a stiff-necked people. If for a single moment I should go up among you, I would consume you. The disastrous word that is the people are mourning right here is what God has done in identifying the gap between their nature and his nature. There's a big gap in between. As it turns out, the people who have just collectively promised to do everything the Lord has spoken, to love and to obey for as long as we all shall live, right? That's what they've just done. They haven't left the altar. They've already broken the first two commandments. And the repercussions are this. If God was to be personally present with them as a holy God, his justice would require their destruction. And so he says, how can I go among you? He's presenting a question that Moses doesn't know the answer to. God knows the answer to it. He actually has a plan, but he's like, Moses, how can I go among you? Because my holiness and your sin do not match. You're a stiff-necked people. Verse 12, Moses said to the Lord, see, you say to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you've said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. The word favor here, we're not going to unpack it today, but we will in the coming weeks. Same word for grace. This is the Hebrew word for grace. You have also found favor in my sight. Now, therefore, if I have found favor in your sight, please show me your ways that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight. Consider, too, that this nation is your people, not my people. Can I read you something funny? This is a side note. Andrea and I had a little joke yesterday morning. Looked at the clock and it said 11:11. We're like, sometimes people like, God speaks to people through numbers. We're not usually those people, but we're aware that God does. So I looked at the clock, it's 11:11 and said, hey, look. And Andrea's like, you should look it up. And we're like, where do we look? And we both said numbers. Numbers 11:11. Oh, wait, I'm in the wrong book. Numbers 11:11. Moses said to the Lord, why have you dealt ill with your servant? Why have I not found favor in your sight that you lay the burden of all this people on me? Did I conceive this people? Did I give them birth? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing child to the land that you swore to give to their fathers? It's a funny message to get on the day when you're preparing a sermon. Like, what did I do? Moses says, if I have found favor, which he has, if I've been given grace, show me your ways that I may learn how to stay in your grace. See, the people, Moses and the people, they have found favor. God has already reached out and saved them and brought them through the waters of baptism. But the question is, so they've already experienced grace, but how do they stay in God's favor? How do they stay in a place of grace? Clearly there's more. For that, they have to know his ways, his character, his nature. Their own nature, their propensity to sin has been exposed. So now they need to know his. God said, verse 14, my presence, pay attention to this word, my presence will go with you and I will give you rest. And he said to him, if your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not your going with us so that we are distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth? Verse 17, the Lord said to Moses, this very thing that you have spoken, I will do, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. Okay? Moses has said, you know me by name, but I need to know your name. If I'm going to follow you and lead this people, I need to know what you're like. I need to know how to stay in grace, and what to do when we find ourselves in crisis. Moses said, please show me your glory. And he said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and I will proclaim before you my name, the Lord. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I will show mercy to whom I will show mercy. So God instructs Moses to get ready. God is going to self-disclose his very essence, the essence of his nature. When he says, I'm going to tell you my name, he's saying, I'm going to self-disclose the essence of who I am. This is the first revelation, the first description we have of God's character in all the Hebrew scriptures. Let's jump to the verses that we'll be unpacking for the next few weeks. It's Exodus 34, 6 and 7. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, meaning thousands of generations, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty. In fact, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. That is the defining revelation of God's character. It's the John 3:16 of the Hebrew Scriptures. It's God's self-disclosure. Verse 6 starts off very warm and fuzzy, right? In fact, those 5 words up there, if we can put them back up for just a moment, that's where we're going to be doing the deep dive and kind of drill down on each one of those. Verse 7 gets a little more uncomfortable and prickly. And what it creates is a tension. There's some tensions in there, isn't there? Because it says that God's slow to anger, and yet he's also just. And justice does require anger. If someone that you love has suffered injustice, what's part of your response to the oppressor? It's anger, right? How can God be both slow to anger and just? He forgives iniquity and transgression and sin, yet doesn't clear the guilty. That's a disconnect. You forgive and you don't clear the guilty. What is that? Keeping steadfast love for thousands of generations who are faithful, and yet bringing the consequences of rebellion on each generation that repeats it, on your grandkids. The Bible Project describes the tension this way. This is beautiful. The question is this: how does a faithful and loyal God deal with such a rebellious people? This is the challenge that God faces in this story, and it's the same challenge he faces in the whole biblical story as he works to rescue the world through this family. So Moses, he said, this is who I am. Moses is in the tension between the things that God's described and also what do we do with the nature of the people and God's nature. And he doesn't know how to solve that tension, but he knows how to respond to this revelation. And so he basically prays this back to God. He doesn't pray the second part, verse 7. He prays the first part, verse 6, right? Listen to what he says. Moses quickly bowed his head toward the earth and he worshiped. And he said, if now I have found favor in your sight, O Lord, please let the Lord go in the midst of us. Bring your presence with us. Be in the midst of us. O Lord, please let the Lord go in the midst of us, for it is a stiff-necked people. And pardon our iniquity and our sin. Take us for your inheritance. Moses knows that God doesn't just clear the guilty because he's just, but he nevertheless asks for God to be merciful. What Moses does here is he leans into God's soft spot, as revealed in chapter 6. Tim Mackey puts it this way. Tim Mackey says that God has a soft spot that he's just made known to Moses and to Israel, that they can appeal to him according to who he is, not according to what they deserve. And apparently, this nature in God is unchanging from generation to generation to generation to generation. He's just shown Moses how to tip the scales toward mercy. God's merciful and just, and he says, if you want mercy, ask for it. Call out to it. Ask for it. So, that's where we're going to be for the next 5 weeks. We're going to look at each one of those things. But here's the thing, that as Tim Mackey said, or the Bible Project, they said that this problem that is experienced here in this passage, that's the story of the whole Bible. It's our story. We have experienced grace, and we still need to know how to stay in God's grace. What do we do? How do we respond when we find that we're on the opposite side of God's justice? Right? What do we do? Moses and the people, what they begin doing over the next, if you read through the rest of the Old Testament, you can do that today. You'll find the authors, the poets, the kings, the prophets, they call back to this. Not always quoting it, sometimes directly quoting the whole thing. There's a significant one in Numbers. I think it's Numbers 14. That's really interesting. But oftentimes they just go, okay, God, you said you were gracious and compassionate. Or sometimes they sing about it. They sing, the Lord is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, rich in love. And they call out his nature because he said, do this. Remind yourselves of it and remind me about it. Ask me to deal with you according to who I am. Moses never understands how God's going to solve that tension. He just knows to plead for God's mercy. We jump forward to the New Testament and we find that solution, that gap between God's nature and human nature is solved in Jesus. Jesus becomes a person taking on human nature, still divine, and offers up his life in our place, becoming sin for us. He became sin who knew no sin that we might become the righteousness of God. He satisfies it on the cross. And then he's resurrected. And then 50 days later, after he's already ascended to the Father, the Holy Spirit comes. The presence of God falls on the day of Pentecost, which is what we're celebrating today. Today we're 7 weeks after Easter. Pentecost is the day that the Holy Spirit came. And the very thing that Moses was praying, Moses said back in verse 12, verse 14 through 16. If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here. And flash forward. If it's not your going with us so that we are distinct, I and your people from every other people on the face of the earth. This promise that God made in Genesis 12, reiterated throughout the Old Testament, that he was going to have a special people, a people for his possession that would be a priesthood to the rest of the nations of the earth, revealing his nature, his character. It's all conditional on us being a people of his presence. And so as we come to the other side of the cross, we understand how God solved the tension by how he can forgive us because he took the price for us. He doesn't treat sin lightly. He takes it so seriously, he gave his life for our forgiveness. But not only does his grace free us from sin, from the guilt of sin and from the stain of sin, it breaks the power of sin. And so I'm going to invite Jesse to come back, and we're going to close this morning by just responding with a song of worship. I'm going to put up one last verse. And this is the gospel as it's described in the New Testament. So this is Titus 2, verses 11 through 14. This is the entire gospel consolidated into this compact little nutshell. And having just heard what you heard, all about Genesis and Exodus and everything that was promised, listen to what's said. For the grace of God has appeared. The grace of God that Moses was asking for. It's been manifested in the person of Jesus. It's put on human flesh. The grace of God has appeared, bringing salvation for who? All people. Not just a genetic nation. It's for all people. Training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions and to live self-controlled, upright, and godly lives in the present age. God's saying, my grace is not only the capacity for you to experience forgiveness from the guilt and the shame, but it's also to train you to experience freedom from sin, to break the power of sin, the habits, the addictions, the patterns, the behaviors. I want to train you to live like me. We have something on the other side of the cross that they didn't have. The wilderness generation, boy, we get to see just how deep indwelling sin is throughout the story of the rest of the Old Testament. Even when people really want to obey God, what they didn't have is God's indwelling presence. We have that. The day of Pentecost, we have Holy Spirit. Training us to renounce ungodliness and worldly passions, to live self-controlled, upright, godly lives in the present age, waiting for our blessed hope, the appearing, the second coming of the glory of our great God and Savior Jesus Christ. He it is who gave himself to redeem us from all lawlessness. He gave himself to close the gap between God's nature and our nature, and to purify for himself a people for his own possession. Moses said, take us for your inheritance. That's who the church is. We are a people for his possession, inhabited by the Holy Spirit, owned by him, and we're called to be zealous for good deeds, to have our hearts transformed from the inside out, to love what he loves, to hate what he hates, to grieve what he grieves, to carry God's image faithfully in the world. And just like Moses recognized, without understanding everything, said, if your presence won't go with us, don't even send us. Like, just call the whole thing off if your presence isn't with us. We could say the same thing today. If we're a church without the presence of God, why bother? How can we just be distinct from all the other people on the face of the earth? We're called to be an alternative to human culture, not an echo of it. To be a people who carry the kingdom with us, to be an outpost of God's kingdom. And what we most need is his presence, and it's exactly what he's poured out. So I want to invite you to just, if you're here on campus, I invite you to stand with me, if you're able. If not, you can sit, you can put your hands out. Whatever it looks like to be in a posture of receiving. And today we're going to collectively and individually respond to this word. And as Pastor Jesse leads us just in a response, it's a prayer. What we're singing is a prayer to say, God, what you've done before, would you do it again today? We don't want to be a people apart from your presence. We don't have any confidence in ourselves. We renounce confidence in ourselves. And we ask you to come and purify us, forgive us, empower us, transform us, shape us, lead us, send us. So we're going to sing this song, and then we're going to do a little bit of ministry time. But I'm going to invite you to just respond to God right where you are. Whatever's stirring in you today, let that be your prayer.